All right, we are back. Today's lesson is the North Winds, Part 1. So we are in Chapter 17.2 and 17.3. Your pages are 542 to 557. We'll be in this section of the book, especially 17.3, for a couple days. So it looks like a lot of reading there, but it really isn't. All right, so what we know, the Civil War began in April 1862 at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Union Army had many successes in the Western Theater, including victories at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, New Orleans, and Corinth, Mississippi. But in the Eastern Theater, which is primarily Virginia, the Confederate Army proved to be formidable, very strong. They win at Bull Run, or Manassas, 2 times actually, and the 7 Days battles, which prevented the Union from reaching Richmond, which kind of blocks the completion of that Anaconda plan that we talked about. The Union Army wins a close battle at Antietam, which is in Maryland, and then Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation shortly after Antietam. So here's what we're going to learn today: how the ever-increasing numbers of casualties led to conscription, which is a military draft, and how changes in military leadership changed the war, and how key battles changed the direction of the war. All right, so we're going to look at some disagreements about the war. So disagreements within the North. So everybody that lived in the North didn't have the same views on the Civil War and secession that all the other people in that region did. So Northern Democrats, remember Lincoln's a Republican, Northern Democrats, they wanted peace with the South, and they protested the continuation of the war. So there's divisions there between the Republicans and the Democrats in the North. Lincoln had protesters arrested and jailed. And then Lincoln does something where he suspends habeas corpus. Now, if you remember from when we looked at the Constitution during our civics unit, habeas corpus prevents governments from arresting and jailing people without actually charging them with a crime. Lincoln suspends that during the war. So in the South, again, disagreement. Not everybody in the South feels the same way about secession or slavery or the war. So some areas of the South remained opposed to secession. So here are a couple critical ones. So one of them is Eastern Tennessee. It's mountainous. They don't have large plantations, relatively few slaves. They still had strong support for the Union. Western counties in Virginia, the state of Virginia, were a lot like Eastern Tennessee. So those counties seceded from Virginia to form a new Union state. There you go. So this whole map, the green part and the red part, used to be Virginia. Virginia was noticeably larger than it is today. But these were counties, and you can figure out now if you look at this map why they call that state West Virginia. They decided that they did not agree with the policies that were coming out of Richmond, and they seceded from a seceding state, and they became West Virginia, and they were part of the Union. So it was a border state for us. The need for more soldiers. All right, so excitement and enthusiasm about the war were decreasing. People signed up eagerly at the beginning of the war, thinking it was going to be very, very short. They were wrong about that. A lot of the enthusiasm was dying down too because they'd seen some of these really, really bloody battles, like Shiloh and Antietam. So fewer and fewer people were signing up to be in either army. It was true for the North and the South, is what I mean by that. This is a major problem because an army can easily lose a war if there aren't enough soldiers to fill the ranks. So the solution was something called conscription. That is a military draft. They're going to start drafting people into the Confederate Army and into the Union Army. So this is how a draft worked back then. This is what you call a draft wheel. This reminds me of when they draw numbers for the lottery or something like that. So people's names would be put in here through that hole, and this thing would be spun around, and the name or number that was drawn out of this drum, guess what? You are going to the army, son. All right. So there's some problems with the draft. Many people in the North saw the draft as unfair. So why would they think that? So here's something that sounds unfair to me 150 some years later. A rich person could hire a replacement to go fight for them, or they could pay a $300 fee to avoid fighting. This, too, favored the rich. As slaves freed by the Emancipation Proclamation continued to stream into the North, meaning they moved up into the North in big urban areas like New York, many people in New York worried that their jobs would go to free African Americans while they were out fighting. So there was this uncertainty and insecurity about coming back from the war, if you were lucky enough to come back and having a job waiting for you. But look over here. In the South, a lot of people in the South thought the draft was unfair too. So depending on your career, you could be declared exempt, meaning you did not have to enter the army. And here's another policy that favors the rich. If you own more than 20 slaves, you didn't have to serve. That was exclusively aimed at the rich people. Most people in the South didn't own slaves, and there were very, very few who owned 20 or more, and they were across the board very, very wealthy. So that was an out of military service for rich folks. So you hear, because of these things, you hear people say it's a rich man's war. The rich folks got us into this war, but the poor men are going to do the fight. So they say rich man's war, poor man's fight. You'll hear that a lot throughout history. So in the summer of 1863, resentment over the military draft erupted in the North. Many Irish Americans were being drafted, and this is what they were afraid of. They were afraid they could be killed in battle, obviously. Their jobs would be given to freed slaves, and the richer classes could buy their way out of the fighting. So all of this anger and frustration boiled over in something called the New York City draft riots in the summer of 1863. It's right after the Battle of Gettysburg. There's a quick video, about 4 minutes on that. I want you to click on it, watch it right there. Oh, back to the battlefield. Oh, what a lovely magnolia tree that is. While the Union continued to enjoy some success in the Western theater of the war, Robert E. Lee, there he is, General Lee, he continued his string of victories in the Eastern Theater in Virginia. So Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, that's what he calls his fighting force at this point. They scored major victories at places like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville in Virginia. A lot of fighting goes on in Virginia. So let's look at Fredericksburg. So this is 3 months or so after Antietam. December 1862, the Union, at this point, they're led by Ambrose Burnside. Lincoln has sacked George McClellan. Burnside is in control now. He arrived at Fredericksburg in November, and he wanted to cross the Rappahannock River, which is one of those many rivers that cut through this part of Virginia. But to cross that river with his army, he needs to have a bridge. There are no bridges in that area, so he has to build one. So they do something. I wanted to do this in class if we were together, but they built something called pontoon bridges, and these are pretty cool. You can see this picture right here. So they lay a bunch of boats parallel to each other across a river, and they put planks and boards. So it's a floating bridge, more or less, so an army can cross. So it takes a lot of work to set those up. You need a lot of supplies. Bad thing is for Burnside and the Union, those supplies are several days late. They have to come down the river from D.C. on the Potomac and then get up the Rappahannock, and it just takes too long. And while there's that delay, the Confederate Army can move into that area and position themselves on the other side of the river. So I thought it was going to be a bloodless crossing of that river. It is not going to end up being that way. It's an absolute disaster, probably. Well, there are a lot of claimants to this title, but it is maybe the worst defeat for the Union in the Army. So Union cannons, they bombard, which means attack with bombs and shells, the town of Fredericksburg from across the river. It caused terrible damage. You can see right here the aftermath of that. These buildings are just crumbled to pieces. So Confederate soldiers hid in basements and cellars and alleys. And we see at Fredericksburg, after the crossing, we see urban fighting, which is fighting in a city. So these guys would pop out of cellars and alleys and shoot at Union soldiers. And then Union troops, this is kind of a bad episode. Union troops pillage the city, means they steal things. They loot the city, more or less. Not good. So this is where the bloodbath gets really horrendous here. So the Union soldiers, they cross that river and they try to take a high ground called Marye's Heights. This is a picture of Marye's Heights. It's not really, the hill is not any taller than the one that's on the playground at school. So above the heights were Confederate big guns, cannons, and at the foot was a small stone wall. This is a picture taken last summer. It's about 4 feet tall. So behind that wall, rebel soldiers hid with their rifles. And as the Union approached that wall, or in Marye's Heights, this hill, these Confederate soldiers popped up with their rifles and just blasted away wave after wave of Union soldiers. So there's a field right here where thousands and thousands of bodies were left after the stage in the conflict. So there it is, again at the bottom. It's one of the greatest defeats for the Union. I've been to a lot of these battlefields. I'd say this is my favorite one. So some numbers and some figures and some graphs here to kind of underline how terrible this battle was for the Union. So it encourages Southern hopes that the Confederate cause could be successful. You see right here, the Union lost 12,500 guys in this battle, while the Confederates only lost 5,000. So it's many, many more Union casualties. And you can see it says right here, Burnside is going to be removed from command after this battle. He's replaced by a guy named Fighting Joe Hooker. People say he's a man who talked and drank too much for his own good, and he's going to have some problems too, just like Burnside and McClellan have had. So the next big battle we're going to talk about is Chancellorsville. It's in May 1863, so about 5 months after the disaster at Fredericksburg. So a lot of times people consider this to be Robert E. Lee's greatest victory. I would like to go into more detail in terms of strategy with you, but we don't have time for that. So we're just going to give you some of the high or low points depending on how you feel about this battle. So it was fought in the same area as Fredericksburg and other battles. So if you look over on the right here, some of you, if your memory is sharp, remember from when we met in school, this is my coffee mug. It has tea in it right here. But if you notice the sticker that I have on the side, that is from the National Military Park in this part of Virginia. So it's from Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania. Chancellorsville is there as well. So there's a little piece to the puzzle. That's what that thing on my coffee mug means. So the Union Army decided to try to go around that same river, the Rappahannock, at a different crossing to come up behind Lee. But Lee was outnumbered, like he's going to be in the entire war, but he's also very, very well prepared. So here we got some figures for it. The Union has superior numbers, over twice as many men. They have 130,000 for the Union, 60,000 for the South. Battle takes place in a wooded area, which erases Hooker's numerical advantage. All those soldiers aren't going to be doing much good for you if you're trapped in the woods and you can't move around and maneuver. So Stonewall Jackson for the Confederates, he marches through the woods with 30,000 of his men to surprise the Union. They come up behind the Union and attack. The Union loses 17,000 soldiers. And when he heard about this loss, Lincoln said, my God, what will the country think? The country's getting tired of all these bloodbaths. The most painful loss of the Battle of Chancellorsville for the South, of course, is the death of Stonewall Jackson. So Stonewall Jackson went out to check out an area at night on horseback with a couple assistants. On his way back, he is mistaken for an enemy soldier by some Confederates. He is shot. He gets 2 shots, I believe, in one arm and then one in his other hand. So his arm first is amputated, and then he is put into a hospital to recover, but he contracts pneumonia and dies on May 10th. So there's a video about the death of Stonewall Jackson right here. I want you to take a look at that, just the first minute and 40. You can watch the whole thing if you want, but minute 40 talks about his death. So that's a huge loss for the Confederates. So that's what it meant. Lee's most trusted and valued general was gone. His loss would be felt for the rest of the war, beginning at a sleepy town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg, just 2 months after Chancellorsville. So if you go out to Virginia, this is the Stonewall Jackson death site. So this is the building that he was in when he died. I think it's about 20 or 30 miles away from the actual Chancellorsville battlefield. This is from last summer. I took this picture when I was out in Virginia. You can see a little placard with information about this death site. There's a little tiny picture of Stonewall Jackson right there. But anyway, he dies, so he's no longer a figure in the war. That's going to be bad news for the Confederacy. All right, so that is where we're going to leave off today. Tomorrow we're going to look at Gettysburg and a couple other critical battles. The siege at Vicksburg. It's going to be really, really great. So take care of yourselves and do the Google form for this chapter, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Later.